Welcome to the Word Room. I'm so glad you're here. We are going chapter by chapter through the entire Bible, Genesis to Revelation, breaking down a summary of each chapter, some key takeaways, and what it tells us about God. Today, we're on Genesis chapter 19, and in this chapter, we see the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. You don't want to miss it. Let's go. All right, so let's look at our summary of Genesis 19. So in this chapter, we see the two angels that were with Abraham in chapter 18. They have now gone down to Sodom, and Lot, who is in the gates of Sodom, sees them and begs them to come stay at his home, and he made a meal for them. So we see, just like Abraham made a meal for the two angels as well as Yahweh, who was the pre-incarnate Christ in the last chapter, now we see Lot doing the same thing for the two angels. They come, obviously, they're in human form. So they come in and they eat because they're in human form. They eat with him. But after they eat, the city's men, and it says both young and old men, come to Lot's house, banging on his door, demanding that the men, which they think are men, which are really angels, who were brought in by Lot, would be sent out so they could sexually abuse those men. They wanted to basically, in essence, for lack of a better term, gang rape these angels. And they're banging, they're screaming, send them out to us. Now, the way this is written in Hebrew, it identifies or indicates that this is a normal practice within this city. It's one of the reasons God's going to destroy the city. He said in the last chapter, their sin was grave and gross and huge. They would basically, homosexuality was rampant within Sodom and Gomorrah, but not just any homosexuality, not just homosexuality alone, but so much sexual deviance that they would literally gang rape anybody who came into the city who didn't live there. Very terrible, horrible sin. And it wasn't just one or two people. It was all of the men of the city. This was a normal practice amongst those who lived in Sodom. Lot ends up doing something terrible as well. Lot, in an attempt to protect the angels, he offers his virgin daughters to them. He says, here, I have two virgin daughters. I'll send them out to you and you could do whatever you want to them. That's a wicked and not wicked response. It's not a justified response. Lot was not righteous. So Lot offered a different type of sin for them to engage in an attempt to protect the angels. Now, this is not a valid response from Lot. It's not like Lot was doing something good here. This was just as evil. It's bad. It's not the same sin that the men of the city were engaged in, but it was bad. He was trying to offer a compromise and sin in doing so. And it ended up not working. They end up turning on Lot after he offers that, saying, why is he protecting them? He's made himself judge, and they go in to attack. So the angels end up taking Lot, his wife, his daughters, and taking them out of the city after the angels struck the mob with blindness. So the angels are going around inside the house. They yank Lot into the house, close the door, and the mob who's trying to get in the house, the angels strike them with blindness and then they wait them out. Basically, they get tired of trying to look for the door because they're blind. Now, that's how disgustingly evil they were, that even after they were struck with blindness, they didn't stop trying to get in the home initially. They just tired themselves out because they couldn't find the door because they were blind. So it took some time, and that they were hell-bent on this evil sin that they were wanting to engage in. The city ends up, after Lot and his family gets removed, the city ends up getting destroyed by fire, and Lot's wife turns and looks at the city. The idea is she's looking longingly for the city. She's longing to go back. And when she does, she is turned into what the Bible calls a pillar of salt. For looking back longingly at the city. That God brought her out, she wanted to go back, and he turned her into a pillar of salt. And then finally, at the end of the chapter, his daughters, Lot's daughters, end up doing something bad. Again, highlighting the fact that they were not righteous people, right? So his daughters end up, to preserve the family name, end up getting their dad drunk and then sleeping with him, and as a result, get pregnant by him, and they bring about children who end up becoming Israel's enemies. Those generations, the Moabites and the Ammonites, end up becoming enemies of Israel, enemies of the promise seed. So this is, again, they were not righteous people. They were evil. It's highlighting that sin, that even though God spared Lot and his daughters, and ultimately originally his wife, but his wife turned back, even though God spared them, it was in mercy that God did so, not because Lot or his daughters deserved to be spared. So 5 key takeaways. Number 1, Lot and his family were not righteous, but they had also not joined in the sin of Sodom and were spared as a result of that. The reason God could spare them and still be just is because they had not joined in the sin of Sodom, even though they were sinful people. And just like I said in the last chapter, there were sin all over the place. There was sin, but God was destroying this particular city because of how grave their sin really was. 2, we talk about the sin of Sodom. Well, what is that? Well, there's a couple things that are mentioned, but ultimately we see that it is clearly a homosexual sexual depravity. If they were fully given to sexual depravity, which included homosexuality, and which the Bible says is an abomination. Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. The sin of Sodom, according to Jude 7, there's only one chapter, so it's verse 7. The sin of Sodom was sexual immorality, giving themselves over to sexual immorality at an extreme level. Again, the fact that they would gang rape anyone who came into the city. Sexual sin of the whole city on a massive scale. Now, Ezekiel 16:49 through 50, some people point to that, and it talks about the sin of Sodom, and it mentions things like pride and arrogance and things like that. And people say, well, that was the sin of Sodom. Well, those sins were involved in the sin of Sodom, but that was not the fullness of their sin. It does talk about in Ezekiel 16 that they committed abominations, the same word used to describe homosexual acts in the Bible. So it's not just of pride and all of those things. The sexual immorality of it all is definitely clearly from this chapter the reason for the destruction. That being said, the reason Ezekiel 16 focuses on things like pride and arrogance and those type of things is because it's comparing the sin of Sodom to the sin that Israel is having at the time of Ezekiel. And so he's making a comparison between that. It also says that God spared Lot because he remembered Abraham. So Abraham had cried out to God in intercession, remember, spare the city, spare the city. And God could not spare the city because there wasn't enough righteousness there. But because he remembered his covenant with Abraham, he spared Abraham's family. He spared Lot as a result of his covenant with Abraham. So Abraham interceded, and God answered, not necessarily exactly the way Abraham wanted him to, but he did answer and spare Lot as a result. This is a very important principle. Our intercession and relationship with the Lord can affect others. Lot was spared because Abraham had connection to the Lord and interceded on behalf of Sodom. So very, very important that your intercession and your relationship with the Lord does affect others. And ultimately, vengeance belongs to the Lord. This is very interesting. The angels, the city was going to be destroyed, right? They were going to be killed. The angels, when the mob was surrounding the house, could have just struck everyone dead. They all die, and then they could leave and escape. But instead, they just struck them with blindness and let them take the time to keep trying to find the door until they finally tired themselves out and gave up. Why is that significant? Because the angels it was God who was going to destroy the city. It was God who was going to bring vengeance on that sin. It wasn't the angel's job. Vengeance belongs to the Lord. The angels just struck them with blindness and let them stay alive. God brought the destruction after that. And finally, sin has consequences. The sin of Sodom had consequences. The sin of Lot's wife turning to long back for the city had consequences. Sin has consequences. So 5 things this tells us about God. Number 1, he hears your intercession. Abraham interceded. God heard that. God remembered that. And that's one of the reasons he spared Lot. 2, he cares for victims. They were victimizing people who would come into the city. He heard the cries of the victims. He cared for victims to the point that he will enact justice against those who victimize others. Number 3, he moves you forward. God moved Lot out of Sodom. God didn't want them to look back at the city. He wanted him to move forward into what God was moving him to now. And Lot's wife turned and looked longingly for the city to go back, and she was destroyed as a result. 4, he hates sin. This is clearly depicted in the fact that he judged sin. He hates sin because it separates you from him. And 5, he is the rescuer. It is God who rescued Lot out of Sodom. 5 things we learned about God. Go study this chapter a little more. Comment down below, what are you getting out of this chapter? And I'll see you in the next one.